Now, this is not a time for confession because so far I can say that I've never driven my car at 160 kilometres per hour. And I was talking to my next door neighbour at Mulberry because he's got a car similar to mine, and then he says, I'm a detective with the police force, so we didn't talk any further about how fast the cars could go. That's right. But if you drive at 160k, you can do it in the Northern Territory, I hear. It will take you less than 1 hour to reach outer space if you go straight up at that speed. At the same speed, it will take you about 100 days to reach the moon. And if you travel at the same speed, it will take you 100 years to reach the sun. And if you want to travel the same distance that light travels in 1 year, it would take you 6 million years at that speed to do 1 light year. And so the light that comes from the sun, how long does it take to come from the sun to us? About 8 minutes. The same light takes about 5 hours to go out to Pluto. And then the same light takes 4.25 years to reach the nearest star to our sun. And that star is called Alpha Proxima. And light takes 100,000 years to travel from one side of the galaxy to the other. That's the Milky Way galaxy. And the furthest galaxies, as far as we know, are about 13,000 million light years away. So even thinking about 1 light year is impossible. But the astronomers talk about thousands of millions of light years, billions of light years. And if that's not mind-boggling enough, in our galaxy there's between 100,000 million to about 400,000 million stars just in the Milky Way galaxy. And if you don't believe me, go on the web and look up the star fields or the Milky Way and have a look at some of the photographs through some of the telescopes they have. And it's just all stars everywhere, and you couldn't count them even in one photograph. And then they estimate that in the known universe, there are 100,000 million galaxies in the known universe. And about 2 or 3 years ago, they changed that estimate to 2 trillion galaxies in the known universe. And so it comes back to what I've said many times here. There are as many stars in the known universe as what there are grains of sand on all the beaches in all the world. And probably true that there's even more than that now. I want to begin by looking at 2 verses that are quite contrasting and yet quite amazing. You have a look at Isaiah chapter 40 and verse 26. This tells us that God is powerful enough to care for all those stars. So Isaiah 40 and verse 26. Lift up your eyes on high and behold who has created these things, that brings out their host by number. He calls them all by names by the greatness of his might. For that he is strong in power, not one fails. So here it tells us that God cares for the stars. And yet what's even more amazing is that in the same chapter, it tells us that he cares for people on this tiny little planet Earth, which is just like a little spot of dust in the universe that goes around a very ordinary sun. In chapter 40 and verse 11, it says, he shall feed his flock like a shepherd. He shall gather the lambs with his arm and carry them in his bosom, and shall gently lead those that are with young. God cares. He has enough power to care for the universe, but he has enough power to care for you and me, as if we were just the only person in the whole universe. I want to talk about 4 dimensions of God's love today. And these are, most of them are coming from the Psalms. These are concepts that have helped me in my own experience, in my own life, and I'm sure that they've helped other people as well. So the first aspect of God's love is that he knows everything about us. Now I've heard, or you've probably noticed, that there's lots of cameras when you're driving. Now not all those cameras are speed cameras. Some of them are just to monitor the traffic. Some of them are to check that you're not using your telephone or your mobile. And disturbingly, there are some of those cameras that are used for face recognition. And in some countries, face recognition is a way that the governments control the people. They know exactly where you're going, what you're doing. And when the Bible tells us that God knows everything about us, it reminds me of what Facebook does, or has been doing, and what Google does, and that is to collect information on people and to use it to make money, and to also have some control over you, because they will present things to you that you've been looking at, and they'll give you more stuff to look at, and they will actually start to control what you look at. And so if the Bible tells us that God knows everything about us, that's just the beginning of an understanding of his love for us. But I want to read Psalm 139 and verses 1 to 11. This is a psalm that I've read sometimes when I've been going through difficult times, through loneliness or feeling isolated. When you shift around all over the place, you don't really feel like you've got a home anywhere. And yet this psalm reminds me, and has reminded me many times, of God's care. O Lord, you have searched me and you know me. You know when I sit down, you know when I stand up. You understand my thought afar off. You surround my path and my lying down. You're acquainted with all my ways. For there is not a word in my mouth, but lo, O Lord, you know it altogether. You stand behind me and before me, you have laid your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me, I cannot understand it. Where can I go from your spirit, or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend up into heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in the grave, behold, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there shall your hand lead me, and your right hand will hold me. If I say, surely the darkness will cover me, even the night shall be light about me. And so the first aspect of God's love is that he knows us better than we know ourselves. But if that was just a clinical knowledge of us, if that was just a knowledge for the sake of controlling us, or a knowledge that was just there to record everything we do, it wouldn't be very comforting. And so the second dimension of God's love is he not only knows about us, but he cares about us. And so another psalm that I've found very helpful through the years is Psalm 23. And this is a psalm I used to recite to myself when I was driving home at night from Port Moresby City out to Pacific Adventist College, driving home alone in the dark and being afraid sometimes, worried about the rascals and worried about the car, whether it would keep going. And this was a psalm that gave me comfort. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of my enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil. My cup runs over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. In the good times, in the difficult times, in the dark times, it says that the Lord is with us, and he gives the promise that he will never leave us or forsake us. And Psalm 103 also has that comfort that God cares for us more than we can understand. Psalm 103 and verses 8 to 13. The Lord is merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and plenteous in mercy. He will not always chide, neither will he keep his anger forever. He has not dealt with us after our sins, nor rewarded us according to our iniquities. For as the heaven is high above the earth, so great is his mercy toward them that fear him. As far as the east is from the west, so far has he removed our transgressions from us. Like as a father pities his children, so the Lord pities them that fear him. For he knows our frame, he remembers that we are dust. Another psalm that has given me comfort is Psalm 22. And you might wonder why this would be a comforting psalm. It was written by David, and most people would know Psalm 23, but not so many would read the one before. It begins with these words, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me and from the words of my roaring? O my God, I cry in the daytime, but you do not hear, and in the night, and am not silent. Here, David is going through a time of distress. It doesn't tell us the story or the time of David's life, but he's going through a time of distress, of discouragement, even despair. And I don't know about you, but I've been through times of discouragement and stress and despair, and I've been through depression. And this psalm has a comfort because it reminds us that other people go through struggles. When we're going through a hard time, to read this is to remind us that we're not alone in those struggles. But I want to read on in this psalm. I want to read verses 16 to 18. For dogs have compassed me, the assembly of the wicked have enclosed me. They pierced my hands and my feet. I can count all my bones, they look and stare upon me. They part my garments among them and cast lots upon my vesture. This psalm goes deeper than just human suffering. This psalm reminds us of divine suffering. Now, we talked earlier in the lesson about people who are living in refugee camps and people who have to go to rubbish tips to find their food. One of the great truths of Christianity is that God has come to this world in person and has come and experienced the suffering and the pain that we go through. That God was a real human being, that he suffered and died. I want to read part of a poem that was written during the First World War, a time of immense suffering. And after the First World War, you might have heard that the Spanish flu swept around the world, and some figures say up to 100 million people died of the Spanish flu. The figures I've heard before were about 20 million. but more people died of the Spanish flu than died during the First World War. But this poem was written by Edward Shillito, and it's called Jesus of the Scars. He says, if we have never sought you, we seek you now. Your eyes burn through the dark, our only stars. We must have sight of thorn pricks on thy brow. We must have thee, O Jesus of the Scars. The other gods were strong, but thou wast weak. They rode, but thou didst stumble to a throne. But to our wounds, only God's wounds can speak. And not a God has wounds, but thou alone. I know people who've been scarred by the trauma and the pain that they've been through. I know people who have self-harmed because of the pain they've been through. But this poem reminds me that Jesus himself carries the scars of the pain of this world in his own hands and in his side and his feet. And so the third level of God's love for us is that he shares our pain. But there's even a deeper level than that. I want you to go to Isaiah 53. So we go out of the Psalms, but Isaiah 53 must be one of the great chapters of the Old Testament. For me, it is probably the most important chapter in the whole Old Testament because it's the clearest picture of Jesus on the cross and of Jesus as the Messiah. And so the fourth level of God's suffering, or of God's love, I should say. Let's read verses 3 to 6. He is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we did esteem him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The punishment of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way. And the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. And so the fourth level of God's love that goes even deeper than his sharing in our pain and our suffering is that he takes our sins and he bears the pain and the shame and the death that comes from our sins. Here we have 4 reasons why we can pray and know that God hears our prayers. And the greatest wonder to me, I used to say this to some of the guys I used to visit in prison, is that God knows everything about me, and yet he still loves me so much that he sent his son to die for me. And that is the greatest wonder of God's love, that he loves us even though he knows everything about us. So he knows us, he cares for us, he shares our pain, he bears our sins on the cross. And my prayer today is that we'll keep holding on to him, keep walking with him and trusting him. Even through these difficult times that we're going through, we need to keep our faith strong. You know, the coronavirus is a great tragedy. One of the church members that goes to Lisa's church in Melbourne was visiting England. She went to a hospital. She contracted coronavirus and died from it. So there are places where there are many thousands of people dying from this virus. It's not very close to us because we've managed to handle it better. But there are places where it's a real tragedy and a real threat. But there's a greater threat to us, and that is that we become complacent or we become discouraged and we let go our faith in God. And so it's really my prayer today is that we'll keep our faith and hold on to him in these difficult times.